The day my son brought his wife home, she thanked me for letting her move in. And that was the moment Margaret Collins realized just how wrong she was. Margaret stood in the doorway of the house she had owned for over 20 years, her hands resting lightly against the polished wood frame as she watched Ashley step inside like she already belonged there. Her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors, her eyes scanning every corner with quiet calculation, and for a brief second Margaret felt something shift, something small but sharp like a crack forming beneath the surface, but she didn't react, she didn't say a word because Margaret had always understood something most people didn't, that silence, when used correctly, was power, and Ashley mistook that silence for weakness almost immediately, smiling politely at first, thanking Margaret for everything she'd done. But the tone was off, just enough to feel like ownership instead of gratitude, just enough to make it clear that in Ashley's mind, this wasn't Margaret's home anymore, it was a transition, a passing of control, and Daniel, standing beside his wife, didn't notice it, or maybe he chose not to. His arm wrapped loosely around Ashley's shoulders, his expression relaxed, unaware of the quiet shift happening right in front of him, and Margaret simply stepped aside, letting them walk in, letting Ashley pause in the center of the living room and turn slowly, taking it all in, the high ceilings, the wide windows, the carefully chosen furniture that had been there long before Ashley ever entered their lives. And then Ashley said it, softly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I think with a few changes this place could really feel like ours." And Daniel nodded, smiling, as if that sentence didn't carry weight, as if it didn't redraw invisible lines in a house that had always belonged to someone else, and Margaret felt the words settle in the air, heavy, deliberate, but she didn't correct her, she didn't interrupt, she just watched, her expression calm, her posture steady, because there was something Ashley didn't know. Something she hadn't asked, something Daniel himself had never questioned, and Margaret had no intention of offering that information freely, not yet, not when the timing wasn't right, so instead she turned toward the kitchen, her movements unhurried, her voice even as she asked if they wanted coffee, as if nothing had just changed, as if she hadn't just heard her own home quietly claimed by someone who had only been inside it for less than 5 minutes. And behind her, Ashley laughed lightly, already talking about paint colors, about rearranging furniture, about opening up the space. And Margaret listened without reacting, her fingers resting briefly against the countertop as she took a slow breath, because she had seen this before. Not the same situation, but the same pattern. The same assumption, the same confidence built on incomplete information. And she knew exactly how it would end, just not when, and that was the part she controlled, the timing, the reveal, the moment everything would shift back into place. So for now she stayed quiet, because silence in the right moment wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual, not because she needed to, but because the house did not feel the same anymore. The quiet was different, heavier, like something had already shifted overnight. And as she stepped into the kitchen, she paused for a second, her eyes moving slowly across the room, because something was missing. The small ceramic bowl she had kept by the window for years was gone, replaced by a tall glass vase filled with fresh white lilies. And for a moment, Margaret just stood there, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the counter, not reacting, not questioning, just noticing, because noticing was what she did best. And then she heard Ashley's voice behind her, bright and casual. "Good morning, I hope you do not mind, I moved a few things around, I think it looks cleaner this way." And Margaret turned slowly, offering a small, polite smile, the kind that revealed nothing, while Ashley walked further into the kitchen like she had done it 100 times before, opening cabinets without hesitation, reaching for mugs without asking, completely at ease, as if the space had already adjusted itself to her presence. And Daniel followed a few steps behind, still half awake, running a hand through his hair, glancing between them without really seeing what was happening. And Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, steady, controlled, her movements calm, even as she listened to Ashley continue talking about changes, about updating the dining area, about possibly repainting the walls in a softer color, something more modern, something that fit their lifestyle. And each word landed softly but deliberately, like small pieces being placed one after another, slowly building something Margaret had already recognized from the start. Control, not immediate, not aggressive, but constant, confident, and completely unchallenged. And Margaret took a sip of her coffee, her expression unchanged, because she had no intention of interrupting the process, not yet. And over the next few days the changes continued, subtle at first, a chair moved here, a picture replaced there, then larger decisions, rearranging the living room, replacing curtains, even discussing hiring contractors to refresh certain areas of the house, and each time, Ashley spoke as if decisions had already been made, as if approval was not required, and Daniel, trusting, easygoing Daniel, simply agreed, nodding along, occasionally asking Margaret what she thought, but never waiting long enough for her answer because Ashley always filled the silence first, and Margaret noticed that too, how quickly Ashley moved to occupy every pause, every space where doubt could exist, and still Margaret said nothing because silence was not empty, it was deliberate. And one evening as they sat down for dinner, Ashley invited a couple of her friends over, people Margaret had never met, people who walked into the house and immediately complimented it, the layout, the lighting, the location, and Ashley smiled proudly, accepting those compliments as if they belonged to her, as if she had built something she had only just entered. And then one of the guests asked casually, "How long have you two owned this place?" And Ashley did not hesitate, not even for a second. "Not long," she said, laughing lightly. "But it is ours now, so we are making it our own." And the table filled with approving nods, soft laughter, easy agreement, and Margaret sat there quietly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes calm, observing every reaction, every assumption, every piece of a story that was forming without her ever needing to speak. And when someone finally glanced toward her and asked, "And you are okay with all these changes?" Margaret met their eyes for just a moment, her expression unreadable, and then she gave the same small, controlled smile she had given since the beginning. "I have learned," she said softly, "that people usually only see what they believe is theirs." And for a brief second, the table went quieter than before, not enough for anyone to question it, but just enough for something to feel slightly off. And then the conversation moved on, laughter returning, glasses clinking, voices overlapping, while Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze steady, because nothing happening in that room surprised her, not Ashley's confidence, not Daniel's silence, not the way strangers so easily accepted what they were told. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning, because the more certain Ashley became, the closer she was getting to something she had never considered, something she had never asked. And Margaret was willing to wait as long as it took for that moment to arrive. Over the following weeks, the changes in the house were no longer subtle, they became structured, deliberate, almost systematic, and Margaret could see the pattern clearly. Ashley was not just adjusting the space, she was redefining ownership, one decision at a time, one assumption layered on top of another until it felt permanent, and Daniel, still trusting, still unaware, moved along with it, agreeing to small renovations, approving purchases, signing off on deliveries without ever questioning the foundation those decisions were built on, and Margaret watched it all unfold with the same quiet composure, never interrupting, never correcting, because every step Ashley took without asking only strengthened something much larger beneath the surface, something Ashley could not see. And one afternoon, Margaret returned home after a short walk around the neighborhood, the cool air still clinging to her coat, and as she stepped inside, she immediately felt it again, that shift. That quiet sense that something had changed in her absence, and this time it was not subtle. The large wooden cabinet in the hallway, a piece that had been in the family for decades, was gone, completely gone, replaced by a sleek modern console table with a mirror above it, and Margaret stopped, her eyes resting on the new arrangement, her expression still, controlled, but her fingers tightened slightly around her gloves, because this was not just a decoration. This was removal, replacement. Decision made without even the appearance of permission. And Ashley's voice followed seconds later, light, almost cheerful. "I hope you like it. I sold the old cabinet this morning. It did not really match the rest of the house anymore." And for a brief moment, the words hung in the air, heavier than before, because this was no longer about preference, this was authority, assumed, exercised and unquestioned, and Daniel stood nearby, shifting slightly, as if he sensed something was off but could not quite define it. "It was just taking up space," Ashley added, brushing it off casually, already moving on to talk about the next change, the next improvement, the next step in what she clearly saw as her home. And Margaret looked at her, really looked at her this time, not with anger, not with resistance, but with quiet clarity, because everything was happening exactly as she had expected. The confidence, the certainty, the complete absence of doubt, and still she did not react. She simply removed her coat, placed it carefully on the hook, and walked past the new table without a word. Because there was no need to correct a mistake that had not yet reached its peak. And later that evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, Ashley brought up something new, something bigger. "I have been thinking," she said, her tone calm but decisive. We should probably put the house under both of our names officially, just to simplify things, for the future. And Daniel nodded slowly, considering it, not out of caution but out of habit, trusting the logic without questioning the premise, and Margaret felt the moment settle, heavier than anything before it, because this was the first time Ashley had reached toward something she did not control, something she assumed was already hers, and Margaret leaned back slightly, her eyes steady, her voice calm as she asked, "And what makes you think that has not already been decided?" And Ashley paused, just for a second, her confidence flickering, not disappearing but shifting, as if she had encountered something unexpected, something she had not prepared for. "Well, it is Daniel's house," she said, recovering quickly, her tone firm again. "So it should reflect both of us." And Margaret held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, the same composed expression returning. "That is an interesting assumption," she said quietly, and then she stood up, ending the conversation before it could go further, before any real questions could form, leaving Ashley watching her with a slight frown, a hint of confusion now mixed into her certainty, and Daniel glanced between them, sensing tension but not understanding its source, and as Margaret walked toward the hallway, her steps steady, unhurried, she allowed herself a single, brief thought, not spoken, not visible but clear. Ashley had finally reached the edge of something she did not understand, and once someone stepped that close to the truth, it was only a matter of time before everything changed. The shift after that conversation was immediate, subtle to anyone else, but unmistakable to Margaret, because Ashley no longer moved through the house with quiet confidence. She moved with intent, sharper now, more deliberate, as if something inside her had been challenged and she was determined to reassert control. And over the next few days, her tone changed, still polite on the surface but firmer, more direct, especially when speaking about the house, about decisions, about what needed to happen next, and Margaret noticed how often Ashley now referred to the future, to plans, to permanence, as if repeating it enough times would make it unquestionable, and Daniel, caught between them without realizing it, continued to agree, continued to move forward, signing small contracts, approving minor renovations, never once stopping to ask the one question that would have changed everything, and Margaret let it continue, because every unchecked step brought Ashley closer to something she could not undo. And one afternoon Margaret returned from running errands, the trunk of her car still filled with groceries, and as she walked up the driveway she slowed just slightly because something felt off before she even reached the front door. A small detail, but enough to stop her, and when she stepped closer she saw it. The front lock had been replaced, new, polished, unfamiliar, and for a moment, everything went completely still. Her hand hovering just inches from the handle, her breath steady, controlled but slower now as realization settled in, not surprise, not shock, just confirmation, and she tried the handle calmly, and as expected it did not open, and behind the door, she could hear movement, voices, laughter, life continuing as if nothing had changed, as if this had always been the case, and Margaret stood there for a few seconds longer, her hand resting lightly against the door, not knocking, not reacting, just allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was. And then the door opened from the inside, Ashley standing there. Her expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly when she saw Margaret, not guilt, not apology but something else, something closer to justification. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Ashley said, her voice calm, almost casual. "We changed the locks this morning, just for security, it is better this way." And Margaret looked at her, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, taking in every word, every choice, every assumption behind it. And Daniel appeared behind Ashley, his expression uncertain now, aware that something was wrong but still not fully understanding what. "It is safer," he added quickly, as if that explanation would settle everything, and Margaret nodded slowly once, her voice quiet even. "Of course," she said, and then stepped inside, Ashley moving aside to let her pass, the new lock clicking softly behind her as the door closed. And for the first time since all of this began, the air inside the house felt different to Margaret. Not because of the changes, not because of the furniture or the rearrangements, but because a line had finally been crossed, one that could not be undone with simple words or polite conversations, and Ashley continued speaking, explaining the decision, listing reasons, talking about safety, about responsibility, about how this was their home now. And Margaret listened without interruption, her silence deeper now, heavier, because this was no longer assumption, this was action, and actions carried consequences, and as Ashley finished, expecting some kind of response, some kind of acknowledgement, Margaret simply placed her keys on the table, the soft sound echoing slightly in the room, and looked at her for a brief moment, her expression calm but distant. "You should have asked," she said quietly, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, and Ashley straightened slightly, her confidence returning almost immediately. "We did not think it was necessary," she replied, her tone firm, and Margaret held her gaze for 1 second longer before turning away, walking slowly toward the kitchen, leaving the words hanging in the air, because what Ashley had just done was not about security, it was not about safety, it was about control, and the moment someone believed they had the right to control something they did not fully understand, that was the moment everything began to unravel, and Margaret knew with complete certainty that the unraveling had already begun. That evening the house felt quieter than usual, not because fewer people were speaking, but because something unspoken had settled into every room, something that could not be ignored anymore, and Margaret moved through the space slowly, deliberately, her steps measured as she prepared dinner like she had done countless times before, her hands steady as she placed plates on the table, arranged utensils, adjusted small details that no one else seemed to notice anymore. And across the room, Ashley sat scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to comment on plans, on changes, on things that needed to be done, her voice confident, uninterrupted, as if the conversation from earlier had already been resolved in her favor, and Daniel sat nearby, quieter now, his eyes shifting more often between them, sensing the tension but still not understanding its depth, and when they finally sat down to eat, the conversation started normally, light topics, simple exchanges, but it did not last long because Ashley brought it back as she always did now. "I was thinking we should start looking into refinancing," she said, cutting into her food calmly. "It would make more sense financially if everything is under our names officially." And Margaret did not look up immediately, she simply continued her movement, slow, precise, placing her fork down before lifting her eyes, her expression unchanged. "Refinancing what exactly?" she asked, her voice even, and Ashley gave a small smile as if the question itself was unnecessary. "The house," she replied, as if it had always been obvious, as if there was no other possible interpretation, and Daniel hesitated this time just slightly, his hand pausing mid-air, because something about the exchange felt different now, sharper, but Ashley continued before that hesitation could turn into a question. "It is just the logical next step," she added, her tone firm, "especially if we are going to invest more into it." And Margaret watched her for a moment, really watched her, the certainty, the assumption, the complete confidence built on something that had never been verified, and for the first time, Margaret allowed a small pause to stretch just a little longer than usual, long enough for the silence to feel intentional, long enough for Daniel to notice it, and he shifted slightly in his seat, glancing toward his mother then back at Ashley. "Maybe we should go over the details first," he said carefully, but Ashley shook her head lightly, dismissing the need for hesitation. "There is nothing complicated about it," she said, her voice calm but final. "It is our home, we should treat it that way." And the word "our" landed heavier this time, sharper, more defined, and Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze steady, because this was no longer just about control, it was about ownership being declared without question. And she spoke again, her tone unchanged. "And what happens if something is not structured the way you think it is?" she asked, not challenging, not emotional, just precise, and Ashley frowned slightly, not in doubt but in irritation, as if the question itself was unnecessary. "I do not see why it would not be," she replied, her voice tightening just enough to reveal the edge beneath her composure, and Daniel looked between them again, his confusion growing now, because the conversation no longer felt simple, no longer felt like planning, it felt like something else, something deeper, and Margaret held that moment for just a second longer before nodding once slowly. "Then I suppose you will find out," she said quietly, and she picked up her glass, taking a small sip as if the conversation had already ended, leaving Ashley staring at her, something unfamiliar beginning to form beneath her confidence, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that appears when a foundation begins to shift in ways that cannot be immediately explained, and the rest of the dinner passed with less conversation than before, Ashley quieter now, though still composed, Daniel more withdrawn, his thoughts clearly turning over something he had not considered before, and Margaret remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, calm, controlled, and silent, because she knew something neither of them fully understood yet, that once someone starts making decisions based on assumptions instead of truth, the consequences do not arrive all at once, they build slowly, quietly, until the moment comes when everything that seems certain suddenly is not, and that moment was getting closer with every word Ashley spoke. The following morning, Margaret noticed something had changed before she even opened her eyes. It was the sound, or rather the absence of it. The quiet hum of the house had been replaced with a different rhythm, one that felt unfamiliar, controlled, almost staged. And when she stepped into the hallway, she immediately saw why. Several boxes were stacked neatly against the wall, labeled in black marker, and further down, two men she did not recognize were measuring the living room, speaking in low, professional tones, their tools spread out across the floor as if they had every right to be there. And Margaret paused, her gaze steady, taking in the scene without reacting, because nothing about this was accidental. This was planned, and Ashley's voice came from the kitchen, bright, organized, already in motion. "Oh, you are up, perfect timing, we are getting started today," she said, stepping into view with a tablet in her hand, dressed sharply, focused, completely in control of the situation she had created. And Margaret did not ask what was happening, she already knew. She simply looked at the workers, then back at Ashley, her expression calm, unreadable, and Ashley continued without waiting. "We are opening up the space, taking down that wall between the living room and dining area. It will make everything feel bigger, more modern," she explained, as if she were presenting a finalized decision rather than introducing a plan. And Daniel stood nearby, his posture slightly tense now, his hands in his pockets, watching the interaction more carefully than before, because something about this moment felt different, heavier. And Margaret let a brief silence settle before she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "You scheduled construction," she said, not as a question but as a statement, and Ashley nodded immediately. "Yes, it is time, we have been talking about it for weeks," she replied, her tone confident. But there was a subtle shift beneath it now, a slight edge, as if she was reinforcing something she needed to believe was already true. And Margaret looked past her, at the wall they intended to remove, at the structure of the house itself, at everything that had been built long before Ashley had even entered the picture. And she took a slow breath, not to calm herself but to measure the moment, because this was no longer about small changes or assumptions. This was about altering something permanent, something that required more than confidence, more than belief, it required authority. And she turned her gaze back to Ashley, her eyes steady. "And who approved this?" she asked, her tone still even, but the question landed differently. This time, sharper, more precise, and Ashley hesitated, just for a fraction of a second before answering. "Daniel did," she said, gesturing slightly toward him, and Daniel shifted uncomfortably, caught in the middle of something he had not fully understood when he agreed. "I thought it would be fine," he added quickly, his voice uncertain now, because he could feel it, the tension, the weight of something he could not yet name. And Margaret held his gaze for a moment, not accusing, not upset, just observing, and then she nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging something that had already been decided long before this moment. And she stepped forward, moving past them, her presence calm but unmistakable as she walked directly toward the workers, who paused slightly when they noticed her, unsure, waiting. And Margaret stopped a few feet away, her posture straight, her voice composed as she spoke. "You can pack up your tools," she said simply, and the room went still, the workers exchanging quick glances, uncertain, and Ashley's voice came immediately after, sharper now. "No, they cannot, we already signed the agreement," she said, stepping forward, her confidence returning quickly, almost forcefully, as if pushing back against something she did not want to acknowledge. And Margaret turned her head slightly, looking at Ashley again, her expression unchanged. "You signed something," she said quietly. "That does not give you permission." And for the first time the words did not pass through the room unnoticed, they stayed, heavy, undeniable, and Daniel looked between them, his confusion now mixed with something else, concern, realization beginning to form. And Ashley's posture stiffened, her certainty cracking just enough to reveal something underneath, something uncertain, something she could not immediately explain away. "This is our house," she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, but no longer as effortless as before. And Margaret met her gaze without hesitation, without raising her voice, without changing her tone. "That is where you are wrong," she said, and the silence that followed was different from all the others, not empty, not passive, but full, because something had just shifted, something that could not be ignored anymore. And for the first time since she had walked into that house, Ashley did not have an immediate answer. The silence that followed did not break immediately. It stretched, thick and heavy, settling into the room in a way that made even the workers shift uncomfortably, their tools still in their hands, unsure whether to continue or stop. And Ashley stood there, her posture rigid now, Her eyes locked on Margaret as if trying to find something in her expression that would make sense of what she had just heard. But there was nothing to find, no anger, no hesitation, just calm certainty, and that was what made it worse, because confidence without emotion was not something Ashley knew how to respond to. And for the first time since she had stepped into that house, her control did not feel absolute. "I think there is a misunderstanding," Ashley said finally, her voice measured, controlled, but no longer effortless, and Margaret did not interrupt her. She simply waited, allowing Ashley to fill the silence the way she always had. "Daniel owns this house," Ashley continued, turning slightly as if to pull him into the statement, to reinforce it, to make it real through repetition. And Daniel looked at her, then at his mother, his expression uncertain because something about the certainty he had always assumed was now beginning to feel unstable. "Mom?" he said quietly, not as a challenge but as a question, and Margaret turned her attention to him, her gaze softening just slightly, not with weakness but with recognition, because Daniel was not the one driving this. He was following something he had never questioned, and she spoke to him, not to Ashley, her voice steady. "Daniel, have you ever seen the actual ownership documents for this house?" she asked, simple, direct, and Daniel hesitated, the question landing in a place he had never examined before. "I mean, it has always been ours," he said, but even as he spoke, the words sounded less certain, less solid, because ours had always been assumed, never confirmed, and Ashley stepped in quickly, her tone sharper now, trying to regain ground. "This is not necessary," she said, her eyes returning to Margaret. "We do not need to go through paperwork just to prove what is obvious." And Margaret let a small pause settle again, just long enough for the word obvious to echo in the room, and then she nodded slightly. "You are right," she said calmly. "We do not need to prove anything that is obvious." And she reached into her bag, her movements slow, deliberate, not rushed, not reactive, and Ashley watched closely now, her confidence thinning just enough to reveal the tension underneath, because something about this moment felt different, final, and Margaret pulled out a thin folder, worn but carefully kept, and held it in her hand without opening it yet, her gaze still on Daniel. "But sometimes," she continued quietly, "what people think is obvious is not the same as what is real." And Daniel swallowed slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder now, because something inside him was starting to shift, something that had been unquestioned for years, and Ashley crossed her arms, her posture tightening. "Even if there is some technical detail," she said, her voice controlled but edged now, "it does not change the fact that this is our home." And Margaret looked at her then directly, her expression calm but unmistakably firm. "That depends on what you mean by home," she replied, and the room went quiet again, deeper this time, because the conversation was no longer about renovations or preferences or plans. It was about something else entirely, something structural, something that could not be adjusted or redecorated. And Margaret finally opened the folder, not fully, just enough to reveal the first page, legal print, formal, unmistakable, and she did not hand it over yet, she simply held it there, letting the presence of it exist before the explanation, before the reaction, because timing mattered. And Ashley's eyes moved to the document, her expression tightening, her certainty now clearly shaken, not gone but no longer stable, and Daniel took a small step forward, drawn by something he could not yet define, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. "What is that?" he asked, and Margaret looked at him, her voice steady, her tone unchanged. "Something you should have asked about a long time ago," she said, and in that moment the balance in the room shifted completely, not through force, not through volume, but through truth waiting just long enough to become undeniable. Daniel did not reach for the folder immediately, he just stood there, his eyes fixed on it as if the answer inside might change something he was not ready to confront, and Ashley noticed that hesitation. She felt it before she understood it, the shift in his posture, the way his certainty was no longer automatic, and she stepped closer, her voice tightening just enough to reveal the pressure beneath it. "Daniel, you do not need to look at that," she said, her tone controlled but no longer calm. "This is being made more complicated than it needs to be." And Margaret did not move, she simply held the folder in her hands, waiting, because this moment was not about forcing anything, it was about allowing the truth to be seen when someone was ready to see it. And Daniel finally stepped forward, slower than expected, his hand reaching out, then pausing again for just a second before taking the folder from his mother, and the moment his fingers touched it, something shifted, not in the room but inside him, because for the first time this was not assumption, this was something real, something that could not be explained away with confidence or repetition. And he opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the first page, then the next, his expression changing not all at once but gradually, confusion first, then focus, then something heavier. Something that settled in his chest as the words began to make sense, and Ashley watched him closely, her arms crossed tighter now, her posture defensive because she could see it. She could see that whatever he was reading was not aligning with what she believed, and she stepped closer, trying to regain control of the moment. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice sharper now, less composed, and Daniel did not answer immediately. He kept reading, his brow tightening slightly, his grip on the folder firmer now, and Margaret remained exactly where she was, her gaze steady, her breathing calm, because this was the point where silence mattered most, the space between discovery and reaction. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, slower, as if each word needed to be confirmed before it could be said. "It says the property is owned by Collins Holdings LLC," he read, his eyes moving across the page again, searching for something, anything that would match what he had always believed. But it was not there, and Ashley shook her head immediately, dismissing it. "That is just a structure," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "That does not change who owns it." But Daniel did not look at her, he kept reading, turning another page, and this time his expression changed more visibly, his shoulders stiffening, his jaw tightening slightly, because now the information was clear, undeniable, and he looked up, not at Ashley but at Margaret, his voice almost uncertain. "You are the sole managing member," he said, and the words landed heavily in the room, because they were not an opinion, not an interpretation, they were a fact, and Ashley's expression shifted instantly, the confidence she had carried for weeks cracking in a way that could not be hidden anymore. "That does not mean anything," she said, but her voice was no longer steady, it was thinner now, stretched, as if trying to hold something together that was already coming apart, and Margaret met her gaze calmly, her tone unchanged. "It means everything," she said simply, and Daniel looked back down at the document, reading again, slower this time, making sure he understood, making sure there was no mistake. And the room around them felt different now, the workers silent, still standing by their tools, no longer part of the process, just witnesses to something they had not expected. And Ashley took a step back, just one, but it was enough to show the shift, enough to show that the ground beneath her was no longer as solid as she believed, and she looked at Daniel again, searching for reassurance, for something that would restore the certainty she had built everything on, but Daniel did not give it. Because he could not anymore, and Margaret watched them both, her expression calm, not satisfied, not vindictive, just steady, because this was never about proving someone wrong, it was about revealing something that had always been there, waiting, and now that it had been seen, there was no way to return to what they believed before. And for the first time since she had walked into that house, Ashley had nothing left to say. No one moved for several seconds after that. Not Daniel, not Ashley, not even the workers, because the kind of silence that filled the room was no longer uncertain. It was final, the kind that follows when something undeniable has just been revealed. And Daniel slowly lowered the folder, his hands no longer steady, his eyes still scanning the pages as if he might find something different if he looked again. But the words did not change. They stayed exactly where they were, clear, legal, absolute, and he looked up at his mother, really looking at her now, in a way he had not done in years, as if trying to understand how something so important had existed right in front of him without him ever questioning it. "You put the house in an LLC," he said quietly, not accusing, not angry, just trying to process what that meant, and Margaret gave a small nod, her expression calm. "A long time ago," she replied, her voice steady. "Before you ever thought about ownership." And Ashley let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief, something in between, something strained. "So what, you are saying none of this is ours?" she said, her tone sharp now, no longer controlled, no longer polished, because the certainty she had built everything on had just been pulled out from under her. And Margaret turned her gaze toward her, not harsh, not cold, just direct. "I am saying you never asked what was actually yours," she answered, and the words landed harder than anything else, because they were not emotional, they were factual, and Ashley opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately, her thoughts moving too fast, trying to rebuild something that no longer had a foundation. "We live here," she said finally, her voice lower now, less certain. "We pay for things, we make decisions," and Margaret nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Living somewhere does not make you the owner," she said calmly, "and making decisions without authority does not make them valid." And Daniel exhaled. Slowly, the weight of it settling in because now it was not just confusion, it was realization, the kind that does not come all at once, but piece by piece, each part making the next one harder to ignore. And he looked around the house, the changes, the new furniture, the plans that had already been set in motion, and for the first time he saw them differently, not as progress, not as improvement, but as actions taken without understanding. And Ashley stepped back another half step, her posture no longer firm, her arms no longer crossed tightly, because there was nothing left to defend in the same way. And the workers quietly began gathering their tools, not because anyone told them to, but because they understood what everyone else was just beginning to accept, that they were not supposed to be there, not without the approval that had never been given. And Margaret watched it all without satisfaction, without triumph, because this was never about winning, it was about clarity, and clarity does not need volume, it only needs truth. And Daniel finally closed the folder, holding it in his hands as if it weighed more than paper should. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost uncertain. And Margaret looked at him, her expression softening just slightly again. Not with regret, but with honesty. "Because you never asked," she said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else, because it was not an excuse, it was a reflection. And Daniel looked down for a moment, the realization settling deeper, because everything that had happened over the past weeks, every decision, every assumption, had been built on something he had never confirmed. And Ashley said nothing now, her silence completely different from Margaret's. Not controlled, not strategic, but empty, because the certainty she had relied on was gone. And as Margaret turned slightly, her posture still calm, still composed, she spoke one final time, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that no one in the room could misunderstand it. "This house was never yours to take," she said, and this time no one argued, no one interrupted, because there was nothing left to question.